Hello, everyone, and welcome to Critical Thinking through English Composition. Today, I'm going to be doing two things. First, I'll be talking about deductive arguments. I'll be doing the second half of our deductive argument class. I'm also going to be talking about the midterm exam. So let's get started. And just to quickly begin, just a moment here. Okay, so just a quick review of what we covered in our last class. A deductive argument is basically a way of putting together an argument whereby if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. There's no way of accepting that the premise is true, but also rejecting the conclusion. If the premise is true, then the conclusion must also be true. You can put a little bit of caveat here, or a little bit of a disclaimer. There are many premises that are not ironclad, meaning very few premises you will find are 100%, without exception, which is one of the reasons why we have what's called a valid argument, which is when an argument follows the form of a deductive argument, but it's not necessarily true. The premise may be false. And a sound argument is when not only does it follow the form, but also the premise is correct. So in our last class, we looked at modus ponens. If P, Q, P, therefore Q. So if P is true, then Q logically follows. P is true, therefore Q must also be true. Modus tollens, which means if P is correct, then Q must also be correct, or must also be true. However, Q is not correct. And because Q is not correct, because the conclusion is not correct, therefore the premise is also false. And the third and final deductive argument that we looked at was the hypothetical syllogism. Now, this is sort of a causal chain. If P is true, then Q is true. And if Q is true, then R is true. Therefore, if P is true, then R is also true. If the first statement is true, then the last statement is true, allowing you to skip over the middle part. Okay, so very, very quickly, modus ponens. I have a couple of examples here. If there's ice on the roads, they will be slippery. There is ice on the roads. Okay, therefore the roads are slippery. There's no way to accept the truth of the premise, there is ice on the roads, without accepting the conclusion, the roads are slippery. My second example here, if you forget your girlfriend's birthday, she'll be angry with you. You did forget your girlfriend's birthday. Guess what? She is angry with you. The truth of the conclusion comes from the truth of the premise. Modus ponens. Let's imagine you have a friend called Bill, and you know that your friend Bill ran a race earlier in the day, but you didn't go to the race, so you don't know if Bill won a gold medal or not. Well, if Bill had won the race, then he would have received a gold medal. That's true. If Bill had won the race, then he would have received a gold medal. But if you know that he does not have a gold medal, then he must not have won the race. So in that case, because the conclusion is false, therefore the premise must also be false. Here's a scientific one, the second one here. If an object is made of iron, it will be attracted to a magnet. So imagine you have an object and you want to know if this object is in fact made of iron. If the object is not attracted to a magnet, it must not be made of iron. So if the object is made of iron, P, then it will be attracted to a magnet, Q. It's not attracted to a magnet, not Q. Well, therefore, it must not be made of iron, therefore not P. And then the hypothetical syllogism, if Korea wins the World Cup in 2026, I will lose a bet with my friend. If I lose a bet with my friend, I will have to give him a lot of money. So if Korea wins the World Cup in 2026, I will have to give my friend a lot of money. In our class, this was probably the most commonly used deductive argument in our class activity because it is quite a simple one to put together. We can think of three things that very easily follow each other. And if the first thing happens, then the third one will inevitably happen. The second one is simply a link. Okay, now I would like to go on to 3 more deductive arguments. So we will have a total of 6 deductive arguments. The first is the disjunctive syllogism. It's either A or B. A dilemma, which will be a choice between 2 sort of unpleasant or 2 options which will have negative consequences, and you have to make a choice between ultimately receiving one set or another set of unpleasant consequences. And finally, a reductio ad absurdum. So let's quickly go through these. The disjunctive syllogism, it's either P or Q. It's not P, therefore it must be Q. If you have been able to take a number of options and then boil them down to 2. So it must be A or it must be B. If you can certainly, without doubt, cancel B, then it must be A because you've brought it down to simply 2 final options. In this case, it's either A or B, or I'll do the P or Q. It's either P or Q. If it's not P, then therefore it must be Q. Or if it's not Q, therefore it must be P. You're affirming one by denying the other. Only one can be true. Both cannot be true. And both cannot be false because it's come down to an either P or Q. Let's say, for example, either Bob or Joe robbed the bank. Joe did not rob the bank. Let's say you are able to exclude Joe. That Joe has an ironclad alibi. We know he was not robbing the bank at the time. Therefore, Bob robbed the bank. Now, one of the difficulties of doing disjunctive syllogism correctly is there are many cases where it's not a simple choice between 2 things. There could be other possible options. Now, I'll just give you a very, very, very simple example of how it can be done correctly. Let's say you go to a restaurant and they only have 2 dishes. They have fish and they have chicken. And if you think to yourself, well, I'm allergic to fish, so I can't eat the fish. Therefore, I have to eat the chicken. In that case, you've got 2 clear choices. Maybe there's no vegetarian dish. There's no salad. It's either the fish or the chicken, and you cannot eat the fish because you are allergic to fish. Well, therefore, you have to eat the chicken. It's either P or Q, and it cannot be P, therefore it must be Q. However, there are very few cases where there are simply 2 options, and this is where you have to be careful about falling into the trap of a very common logical fallacy. And this is known as the either-or fallacy. And this is where a complicated issue is boiled down to 2 choices, and it actually misrepresents the complicated nature of this issue. So instead of saying, for example, I'll use the one here. Since you don't spend a lot of money, you must be saving a lot of money. This actually is not necessarily true. If somebody doesn't earn a lot of money, well, then they're also not spending a lot of money, but simultaneously they're not saving a lot either. So be careful if you try to use the disjunctive syllogism. Make sure that this is a situation where there are two clear choices with no viable alternatives. After the midterm, we will be looking at logical fallacies. And one of the logical fallacies is the either-or fallacy, which is where a complicated situation or a complicated issue with many possible nuanced positions gets boiled down to two options, which actually misrepresent the complicity of the situation. You're either for us or against us. You're either with us or you're with the enemy, is a good example of this either-or fallacy. Okay, the dilemma. Here we go. Oh, nice little romantic dilemma here. The closer two hedgehogs get to each other, the more likely they are to poke each other with their spikes. But if they remain apart, they will be lonely. And so it is with people. Being close to someone inevitably creates conflict and provocations and opens us up to a lot of pain. But on the other hand, we are lonely when we stand apart. Okay, so this is a very interesting analogy. It's comparing, two hedgehogs getting close to each other with two human beings opening their hearts. In this case, we have the dilemma. In this case, there are two possible options: get closer together or remain apart. If you get closer together, then you open yourself up to pain. But if you remain far apart, then you will continue to suffer from loneliness. So there are two possible options, two viable options, and both of them have some kind of negative consequence. So you can either choose negative consequence A or negative consequence B. I believe in the textbook it says it's either P or Q. If P, then R, meaning if I choose P, then R will be the consequence. And if I choose Q, then S, and S is another negative consequence. So if P, then Q, if P, then R, sorry, it's either P or Q. If P, then R, if Q, then S. So you've got two options, two viable choices. Both of them have some kind of unpleasant consequence. By the way, for the purpose of our class, there has to be some kind of negative consequence or unpleasant result for both of the options. In one of my other classes, somebody said, I need to eat lunch, and there's a Burger King and a McDonald's, and I like both, and I can't decide. I wouldn't accept that as a dilemma, because in both cases, the person is going to have what they want, meaning they would, if they choose McDonald's, they can eat the burger that they enjoy. If they go to Burger King, then they'll have the burger they enjoy. Granted, they will not be able to have both, and they do like both, but I wouldn't consider that a dilemma. A dilemma, for the purpose of our class, should be a situation with two clear choices, and each or both choices will include some kind of negative consequence. That's key. So you might have some sort of moral or ethical problem. This is very, very commonly done. Let's say you need money, and maybe you don't have enough money for school, or you don't have enough money for food. You don't have enough money to live for some reason. But then you find a wallet full of cash. Now, if you take the cash, then you become a thief. And there's some ethical problem here. You could be betraying your values, which is a negative consequence. On the other hand, if you don't take the wallet, then you will continue to have no money and maybe have no money for food or no money for school or for rent. So in both cases, there would be some kind of negative consequence. All right, and the third and final deductive argument that I'd like to talk about is called reductio ad absurdum. This means to reduce to absurdity. Essentially, what you're trying to do is this deductive argument is actually a response to someone else's argument. If you hear an argument and you just think, I don't believe this person's argument, I think this person's argument is false. Not only is it false, but to believe it is absurd. It is stupid. It is foolish to believe it. In that case, you can use this deductive argument. How do we do it? I will explain. Let's say you hear, okay, someone says that the moon landing was faked. This is a good one, right? So you hear either on the internet or from a classmate or from a family member, someone says, man or people, mankind, never went to the moon. The moon landings in 1969 were faked. Now, you don't believe that. You believe that the moon landings were real. That's P. You believe that the moon landings were real. So how do you prove that? Well, you prove that by assuming the opposite. So if somebody says, okay, the moon landings were faked, and you say, I believe the moon landings were not faked, and I'll prove it to you. Let's assume the opposite. Let's assume that the moon landings were faked. So let's assume I'm wrong, not P. Well, if the moon landings were faked, then we also have to conclude Q. And Q will usually be a look at possible consequences. Like, you know what? If the moon landings were faked, that also means, and then you will give a list of criteria that show it's so unbelievable to say that the first one could be true that it must be false. It is so ridiculous that it must be untrue. So you've taken their argument and you've reduced it to absurdity. So we have to conclude that P must be true after all. Let's look at a couple of examples. By the way, this one here, the one about no one having had sex in space, this is not my personal example. This is from the textbook. Okay, so if I believe that no one has ever had sex in space, but someone says, you know what, I'm sure, you know, given the number of people that have gone up in space, I'm sure there must have been some kind of sexual act up in orbit. I want to argue that no one has had sex in space. That's P. In order to prove P, I'm going to temporarily accept the opposite. I'll accept the other person's argument. I'll say, okay, let's assume someone has had sex in space. That's not P. If we assume that someone has had sex in space, that means that someone had sex in space and didn't tell anyone. They kept it a secret. There are no pictures, no video evidence. There's been no posting about it on social media. That's Q. And I think in this day and age, that's really hard to believe. If someone had had sex in space, they would not have kept it a secret. It would have been put somewhere on the internet, and that fact would be well known. No one would keep that a secret, therefore Q is highly unlikely. And from that, I have to assume that my original argument, P, no one has had sex in space, is correct. Let's take a look at a couple of other examples. So here's the moon landing hoax. This is the one that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So if someone were to tell me that no one landed on the moon in 1969, I would say, of course, American astronauts went to the moon in 1969. Some people, however, insist that the moon landings were a hoax. Okay. Let's imagine that it was a hoax. So let's imagine not P. Let's imagine that it was a hoax. That would mean Q. And this is Q. NASA employed thousands of people to put astronauts on the moon. And that means that all these people knew it was a hoax, but kept silent for the rest of their lives. Not even a single person came forward to say that it was a hoax. And that is ridiculous to think that NASA was able to keep all of these people silent. Thus, it's only reasonable to believe that the landings were not a hoax. So if I want to prove that the moon landings were not a hoax, I start off by assuming the opposite, that the moon landings were a hoax. And from that, I try to guess what that would mean. Well, if the moon landings were a hoax, that meant that NASA employed thousands of people, and all of these people involved in the hoax were able to stay quiet for their whole lives. And that is so unlikely, so absurd, that it's only reasonable to believe that the moon landings were not a hoax. Okay, one more example of reductio ad absurdum. This is a great one here. Ancient Egyptians benefited from alien technology, or aliens came down to Earth and helped the ancient Egyptians to build the pyramids. You can use reductio ad absurdum to show how unlikely or ridiculous this claim actually is. So if somebody says, aliens helped the ancient Egyptians to build the pyramids, I will start off by saying, okay, let's assume that's true. If that's true, then that also means something else. That's going to be Q. And Q is so unlikely, so absurd, so ridiculous that we can only conclude the opposite, that aliens did not help the Egyptians to build the pyramids. So let's take a look. Some people claim that the aliens were involved in the building of the pyramids of Egypt. Well, let's assume that the aliens really did build the pyramids. So that's the opposite of my opinion. So that would be not P. We know that the pyramids were shaped by simple hand tools, and we can see the chisel marks on the stones. We know that. We know that these pyramids were built with simple tools, and we can see evidence of that on all the stones. If aliens built the pyramids, which would be P, not P, that would mean that although they had the technology to travel from a distant planet to Earth, the aliens had to rely on the Egyptians' simple hand tools to shape the rocks. It's ridiculous to think that an alien civilization that was capable of traveling between planets would not have some tool, like a laser, to carve the stones used in the pyramids. Okay, so remember, I want to argue that it's very unlikely that that any aliens helped to build the pyramids. So that's my position. That's P. I start off by arguing or by accepting not P. Okay, let's say not P, which means let's assume the aliens really did build the pyramids. Well, if the aliens didn't really build the pyramids, then Q. In this case, Q is aliens traveled from very far away in space using very advanced technology. But when they got here, they had to rely on the ancient Egyptians' simple hand tools. And that is so incredibly unlikely that they would have the technology to get here, but have no tools to do anything else, that we can only conclude the opposite, which is P, that aliens did not help build the Egyptian pyramids. Okay, Here's one last one. Quote, some people believe that ordinary citizens should be allowed to own any weapons that they want. Suppose that this were true. That would mean that ordinary citizens could own tanks, fighter jets, and even nuclear weapons. Clearly, ordinary citizens should not be allowed to own nuclear weapons. And thus, it is false that ordinary citizens should be allowed to own any weapons that they want. Okay, so somebody has argued here, ordinary citizens should be allowed to own any weapon that they want. I believe the opposite. I think ordinary citizens should not be allowed to own any weapons that they want. So my argument is P. I will prove that by starting with, let's imagine not P is true. Let's imagine citizens could buy any weapons that they wanted. Well, from that, we can extrapolate that ordinary citizens could then own tanks, fighter jets, or even nuclear weapons. And that is clearly such a ridiculous policy that we can only conclude the opposite, that ordinary citizens should not be allowed to own any weapons that they want. Okay, now just as I gave sort of a little warning for the other deductive arguments, like the disjunctive syllogism, where you have to be careful about making the mistake of it's either A or B, because in many situations there are more than two possible options. You also have to be careful about using reductio ad absurdum just because you cannot imagine something can be true. Just because you say, I cannot imagine that this is possible, therefore the opposite must be true. This is sometimes also called the argument from ignorance, or I can't imagine that, therefore the opposite must be true, or I can't imagine that, so something must be false. Be careful about that. Reductio ad absurdum is one of those deductive arguments that can very easily be misused. Okay, I'll skip through that. This is just a quick summary of that, so we don't need to do that one. Midterm difficulty. Okay. In my next lecture, I'm going to be talking about what's on the midterm exam, and I wanted to give a couple of examples of problems that students had in the last semester with one part of the exam. One part of the exam, I ask students to make an analogy. I say, life is like something. And in the last semester, many students had difficulty with this problem on the midterm. So I want to share some of the feedback that I gave them after the midterm. In this case, I'm giving it to you, lucky students, before the midterm. So listen up. All right. So in the last semester's midterm exam, one of the options for an analogy that I gave students was negotiating an important business contract with another company is like. So in this case, students had to say that negotiating an important business contract with another company was relevantly similar to something else. And then they had to list the relevant similarities and differences and explain why it was the relevant similarity was stronger. Now, in this case, somebody said persuading someone to marry you and lowering your standards for a future spouse. And I think in this case, the difference between the two actions is so great that the analogy is not weak. For example, an important business contract, a business contract is a temporary thing, whereas persuading someone to marry you, that is possibly for a lifetime. So although there is some relevant similarity, you are trying to convince someone to make some kind of commitment. I think the nature of that commitment is so different that the analogy would be weak. The same thing with lowering your standards for a future spouse. Oh, that was an interesting answer. So those would not be good analogies. Or getting a university diploma. So graduating from university and getting a diploma. What is that like? If you wanted to explain, getting a university diploma is very similar to, now, these were some of the examples that students in the last semester gave, and pretty much all of these, I would say, are relatively weak because the difference is too great. Working in a company, no, working in a company, both include a lot of hard work, but, university has a set beginning and end, graduating and getting the diploma. Working in a company, not so much. Having a key to success, no. A university degree can be a key, but getting it, the graduating, is not a key. Climbing a mountain, that might be... the process of going to university, yes. But getting the university degree would be more like reaching the top of the mountain. Putting a cherry on top of a cake, please don't mix metaphors. Please don't mix metaphors. Working as an emergency ambulance driver, I don't know why the student thought that getting a university diploma was relevantly similar to working as an emergency ambulance driver. But remember, I think here the differences are clearly too great. When you make an analogy on the midterm exam, please remember to keep the relevant similarities as strong as possible. You want to make a strong analogy. Trying to decide which restaurant to go with your friends is like deciding who to date. I can see the similarity, but the difference is the nature of it is too different. Remember, a good analogy should be looking at two things that are not exactly the same, but have something that is so relevantly similar that it can help us gain a deeper understanding, as well as possibly lead to a conclusion. Like these two things are alike in one way, therefore they should be alike in another way. You might remember the female Russian astronaut who said, women in our country are great railroad workers, so they should, also be able to be great astronauts too. Possible analogies, yeah, I'll skip. Sometimes a particular topic has a very clear built-in analogy or set of analogies. I'll give you a very quick example of what I mean. Negotiating an important business contract. When you take a look at the business world, if you learn any kind of business English, you will find that there are so many analogies that compare the business world to sports in some way. There are countless idioms, talking about level playing fields, moving the goalposts, having an unfair advantage, scoring goals, etc. We use so many idioms from the sports world when we talk about business. And this is why you could very easily say that negotiating an important business contract is similar in some way to a game of football, in this case, competition, playing a game of poker, or maybe even building a bridge, which is different. If you talk about competitive games, like a game of football, a game of poker, these are zero-sum games. One person wins, another person loses, or one team wins, one team loses. Some people, however, say that we shouldn't look at business that way. We should look at mutually beneficial agreements. So negotiating an important business contract is not where one side wins and one side loses, but where both sides build a connection that will benefit both sides. I think both analogies here would work very, very well. Okay, getting a university diploma, you could say, is very much like receiving an award, reaching the top of a mountain, or finishing a marathon. Deciding which restaurant to go with your friends is like, several people trying to drive a car at the same time. If several people try to drive a car at the same time, you're going to crash, and you're most relevantly, you're not going to reach the desired destination. If you have several people trying to decide what restaurant to go to, you might not go anywhere because no one can agree. So several friends trying to decide which restaurant to go to for lunch is kind of like several people trying to drive a car at the same time. Okay, I'd like to give what I consider here one of the best analogies that I've heard. There's a man called Gabor Mate, and he's a Canadian physician. He has a background in family practice, special interest in childhood development, trauma, and he's written a number of books. And he talks about human nature in one of his presentations. Excellent presentation, by the way. If you can understand his strong Hungarian accent. He immigrated to Canada with his family when he was young, but still has a very strong Hungarian accent. In his presentation on human nature, he starts off by saying that there are 3 lies about human nature that make us miserable. These lies are that we're selfish by nature, we're very competitive, we're aggressive, that we are blank slates, human beings that can just be programmed like a computer. Let me go back here. That we're blank slates. The third one here, we are wired for connection, love, generosity. He believes that's actually the truth. So of these 3 ideas, he strongly disbelieves the first 2. He doesn't believe that we're selfish by nature. He doesn't believe we're competitive or aggressive by nature. He doesn't believe that we are blank slates that can be programmed by a computer. He believes that humans are wired in our DNA for connection, for love, and for generosity. Now, he wants to make this point by using an analogy, and I think his analogy is absolutely brilliant, so I wanted to share it with you here. He begins his presentation by asking the audience, how can we learn about the truth of human nature? He says, should we look around us in modern society and see how we are living and interacting with each other, and therefore draw conclusions about what human nature is like from what we see in modern society? Well, he says, let's look at the elephant. How can we learn about the true nature of an elephant? In captivity, so when elephants are in zoos, for example, elephants do not exhibit their natural characteristics, and that's because their environment is very unnatural. In nature, elephants are very socially complex. They live in groups. They have very complex relationships, and there's been a lot of interesting study done on the social lives of elephants. However, in zoos, elephants are isolated in small, often unrelated groups, and this is a very natural environment for the elephant. Now, how is this relevantly similar to humans and how we can try to find the true nature of human beings? Well, let's take a look at his analogy and rephrase it. Just like we cannot learn about the true nature of the elephant by studying its behavior in an unnatural environment like a zoo, we also cannot know about the true nature of human beings by looking at our behavior in modern society. The structure of modern society is radically unlike how humans have existed for most of their time on Earth. Just like how elephants in zoos are living in an environment that is completely different from what they are predisposed to. The way we interact with each other has very little in common with the way humans lived with each other for most of our history, meaning the way we live today in modern society is vastly different from how the human species survived throughout most of its time on Earth. This is relevantly similar to the social grouping of elephants in a zoo and how it is different from the way they evolved as a species. So, to conclude, just like we should not look at how elephants behave in a zoo and try to make conclusions about the nature of an elephant, we cannot look at how human beings interact in modern society and think this will give us a deeper understanding of the actual nature of the human species. Okay, so let me take a look here.